Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the most recent, welcome to this edition of the SWR webinar series intended to support folks on the job market. This one is entitled Navigating the Academic Job Market, and today we are joined by four wonderful panelists who will be able to share some insights about the impact that COVID-19 has had on the social work academic job market. Let me introduce myself. I'm the moderator today. My name is Brad Lynn. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the School of Social Work at the University at Buffalo. I'll introduce our panelists in just a second, but let me cover some of the procedures for today. The webinar is intended to be really audience driven. So if you've got questions that you would like me to pose to our panelists, please use the Q&A feature, not the chat. Please use the Q&A feature, and that'll queue up the questions so that I can answer it, or so that I can pitch it to our panelists. The last thing I'll remind everyone before we begin is that there are a number of other webinars resources available on the SSWR website. These events are recorded, and we're pleased to be able to post them on the SWR website for folks to be able to view. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. We've got joining us from Boston, Jorge Delva. Jorge Delva is the Dean of the Boston University School of Social Work and Director and Paul Farmer Professor of the Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health. With over 160 publications, his externally funded research is focused on understanding the etiology of substance use disorders, as well as testing the effectiveness and prevention of treatment programs for these disorders in the US and globally. Thank you, Jorge. Glad you could join us today. Marquita Dorsey is an assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Social Work, where she is in her fourth year on the tenure track. Her research focuses on understanding sexual and reproductive health decision-making among Black adolescent and young adult females, alongside understanding the role of various contextual factors, including Black paternal engagement as a protective mechanism. In addition to engaging in an active research agenda, she has recently served on the search committee for the School of Social Work, engaged in school-wide community-based initiatives, and teaches across social work programs, including the Doctoral Research Methods course. Welcome, Marquita. Thank you for joining us. Next, we've got Catherine Delmas. Catherine Delmas is a professor, associate dean for research, and director of the Buffalo Center for Social Research at the University at Buffalo School of Social Work. Her research focuses on mental health, evidence-based practice, and community-university research partnerships. Her current work is an exciting collaborative project building a data warehouse to support data-informed practice across 14 rural counties in New York State, intended to improve client outcomes. Catherine has served on the recruitment committee at the University at Buffalo for 17 years, and prior to that was on recruitment committees at 3 different institutions. Welcome, Catherine. So glad you could join us. Lastly, we've got Rachel Spear. Rachel is an assistant professor at Bryn Mawr College Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research. She finished up her PhD in June and has experience being on the job market both pre-COVID and post-COVID. Rachel's research is organized around 2 areas of inquiry. The first is how experiences of oppression and trauma affect mental health, physical health, and well-being of marginalized communities and their intersectional identities. And 2, how experiences of oppression and trauma connect to parenting behaviors and the intergenerational transmission of risk among these communities. These interests are rooted in her early career, which includes over a decade of clinical practice as a licensed clinical social worker working with underserved and marginalized communities. Welcome, Rachel. We're glad you could join us. So to kick things off, I wonder if we might begin our conversation by talking about just how COVID-19 has impacted the social work job market, sort of some broad strokes about how the world has changed in the past couple of years. Jorge, would you like to start us off?
Well, thank you, Brad, and thank you for having me in this today's event, and welcome to everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. Pardon me. One impact of COVID and the racial violence that we've observed, or that has become more, we've observed it for a while, right? It's been there. It's not like it was hidden, but it became more salient. And the way COVID impacted more communities of color is that I've noticed where schools of social work are looking for more of the type of scholars that will be paying very, very close attention to marginalized communities in a way that I think is qualitatively different from prior decades, when people would think about topics such as cultural humility, cultural diversity, or diversity in general. It's calling for scholars, instructors, learners who bring a really deep perspective about what's happening in society. So I think that's one of the changes I've seen in terms of the substance of how people are presenting themselves and what schools are hungry for, what our students are claiming for. And I'll stop there, but that's what I've noticed as far as the central topic of need that schools have and want, and society is craving.
Thank you, Jorge. Catherine, or sorry, Marquita, I see your hand up.
I would want to add to what Jorge just said, particularly around identifying COVID-related disparities and how it has disproportionately impacted certain groups. Those groups are also reflected in those that are on the market, and knowing that individuals are going to go to universities that are now more focused on this particular issue. These individuals are also actively engaged in the market. And so thinking about how COVID has impacted universities' attention to the needs that social workers need to focus on, I think it's also imperative that we remember, we as in whether it's job seekers, or institutions that are seeking to hire folks, that the individuals that are actually applying are also experiencing these disparities, right? Whether it is because their families have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 or they themselves. And so it's important that job seekers think about that as they prepare, as well as how they prepare for themselves, like prepare themselves and care for themselves through this process, because we are all still in a pandemic, right? And thinking about how do we navigate functioning and being our best self in the midst of a pandemic is something to really be mindful of.
Thank you, Marquita. Catherine, your thoughts?
Sure. I'd like to, and I fully agree with both of you. And I thought maybe I'll just shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the practicality of being on the job market at this time, because I think the biggest change has been, for us, has been around the campus visit, because everything is done virtually now. And that has really changed the dynamics and the way that you sell yourself to us and we sell ourselves to you when it's all done virtually on Zoom. And I think that has been one of the biggest adjustments I think that we have had in our recruitment efforts, that has really been challenging. It's not the same in a whole lot of different ways, but we're all adjusting and hoping it doesn't last too much longer. But that's a real practical thing that has changed in the whole recruitment process, is the inability to be able to, screen at SSWR and SWR in the same ways the in-person piece of it is just sorely missed.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. Rachel, any opening thoughts from you?
Thank you, Brad. Yeah, and I have to agree with what Catherine is saying, especially as the person who's doing the campus visits, having had the experience of doing it before COVID and getting the opportunity to connect in person with the faculty, with the students, tour the campus, tour the city, try out different restaurants, right? That type of opportunity to connect you to that place, right? Into that location, I think is very challenging in a virtual setting. And so I think it can make it really difficult as an applicant to decide, is this a place where I'd want to move? Is this a place where I want to live? What is the energy like at this institution? And so I think that can be one of the challenges for sure, as a result of some of this shift to doing virtual campus visits, as well as I think what I saw, as well as the timeline playing out with some, and I think we're seeing this now with jobs being posted, right? In some virtual campuses, it's happening earlier, and some not doing it till later. And so it makes it a difficult timeline to navigate as a job seeker in terms of, do I take this opportunity? Do I try to wait for this other opportunity, and not being sure of that? And then ultimately too, right? I know that many of us are experiencing that Zoom fatigue. And then the virtual campus visits are pretty much Zoom for hours on end, sometimes 1 or 2 days in a row. And so I think just being mindful exactly, like Marquita was saying around, taking care of yourself, doing what you need to do to be able to be prepared for those types of experiences.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate your thoughts. We've got a question in the Q&A, and let me read it here real quick. The participant asks, I'm curious if speakers can discuss some of the non-tenure track options. I'm especially curious to know about travel instructors or professors, what they are, how rare jobs are, pros and cons, and so on. Jorge, I'm wondering maybe we can start with you, because you and I have talked about this over email before. So you'd be a good place to start.
Yes. No, thank you. And good question. I think that all of us, as we were answering the first question, we were thinking of at a meta level where this applies to whether someone is a full-time faculty, perhaps part-time, perhaps an adjunct person, perhaps a clinical non-tenure track to institutions. Oh, now the machine likes what I'm saying. Okay, thank you. So it varies from institutions to institutions, but the principles that were just described, the online fatigue, the sense of community that it's difficult to assess from a distance, the living with your own stressors, your own challenges. If you have children, that you have people who have died as a result of the illness, people you care for, the stress level you have, all of that applies regardless of the type of position you're applying. I mean, I'm even going to stretch it to say not just faculty positions, but some schools, we've done this too, look for assistant dean positions that are more staff administrative type. And we've conducted national searches, and the same principles we just described apply to those types of positions as well.
Do any of our other panelists have thoughts about sort of non-tenure track kinds of positions? If not, I'll move on to the next. Catherine.
I was just going to say that, we don't have a lot of non-tenure track. We have clinical faculty that are non-tenure track, and then tenure track faculty, but we don't have some of the other ones that were types of positions that were mentioned. But I agree that it's the same interview process, the same criteria. We're looking for excellence, regardless if it's tenure track or clinical, and it would be at our school, like many others, the same rigorous process one would go through for interviewing, screening, interviewing, and such.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Our next question. Thank you to Brenda Tully for this next question. What tips for applicants do you have for navigating the virtual campus visit based on your experiences hosting, well, I know Rachel has recently had experience as the the candidate. Rachel, I'm wondering, maybe would you be willing to start us off?
Sure, thank you, Brad. Yeah, I think that I like this question too, because as I was going through the virtual campus visits and seeing how it played out differently at different institutions, I was learning a little bit of like what I would recommend, in terms of, in terms of the institution kind of supporting the job seeker and the candidate in that process. And so I think what's really nice is being mindful a lot. So a lot of the schedules I would get would have breaks, in terms of taking a break for yourself or getting lunch or getting water, using the restroom, whatever it might be. And then also some I think were really good at timekeeping. And then some maybe weren't so good at timekeeping. And I am definitely personally the person who pays attention to the clock. And I'm like, okay, this is my transition from here to there. And so I can do this during this time and I'll do that during that time. And so I think one of the things I hope that institutions will do is continue to be mindful of the agenda that they create for the job seeker, so that when it's, if something is going over a little bit, maybe kind of calling attention to that and stopping that process so that that job seeker can have a break. Because I think it can be really difficult to be like 6-7 hours on a Zoom meeting and trying to navigate that. And so I think that's one of the big things for me was creating a schedule mindful of getting breaks and just screen breaks, right? And then also really protecting the applicant's time in terms of protected break time so that they can take care of other things as well. And yeah, I mean, I think that I was surprised though at still how, I was able to get some sense, right, of who people were and what kind of community it was and how people got along with each other. And so I just wanted to leave a little bit of a hopeful note there that it is a different process and maybe not as obvious or as easy to navigate as an in-person experience, but definitely I still was able to get a good sense of where I wanted to land and feel really confident about that decision and still feel like what I thought I felt is true in real life after I moved into the position.
Sure. Marquita.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Rachel's comments, which I think were perfect. In terms of tips, of course, you're in a virtual space, right? And so Rachel pointed out being mindful of Zoom fatigue is really important. Your own body and being aware of what you need, whether it is having water next to you, having a snack somewhere close, not that you'll be eating during your interview, but you want to stay refreshed. But in terms of preparing for this space, right, we may have a practice of practicing our mock job talks in person and being able to move or navigate a room. But it's really important that you practice now. What does it look like? What do you look like on Zoom? How comfortable are you? How is your seating? And the very practical things around you sitting in front of a computer for 30 to 45 minutes, talking about hopefully something that you're super passionate about. Also practicing slowing down and just keeping in mind that you are communicating with people who may not know your passion, can only read about your passion or the work or the passion that you have for your work on paper. But don't be afraid to convey that. Don't be afraid to convey that excitement. I would also encourage a few tips, but in short, I would also just encourage thinking about specifically the university's needs, what they expect from a candidate across different topics and how you fit. And then being able to talk about that in a virtual space, being able to process questions in a virtual space, making sure that you practice slowing down and thinking through your statements, breathing. Those are really important as you are really talking about how you might fit for this space that, as Rachel put it, you may not intuitively really be able to feel if this is the perfect space for you because you're not there in person. But it is really helpful for you to practice as much as you can and then stop after a while. So that way you can breathe and really be comfortable with what you intend to present going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Marquita. Any other comments from our panelists?
I'll just add something and build on what Marquita said, that I think it is important that people do their homework about where they're interviewing at and come prepared to ask some questions about the university, the community, specific program that you read about. Show that you have some genuine interest in considering the place you're interviewing with, and that you ask some good questions, tells those of us on the other side that, boy, they really are interested in potentially coming to our place. The other thing I'll just add to is campus visits in person are equally as daunting and go a lot more hours. They go from early in the morning to late at night. And what I would say to both those doing virtual visits and doing in-person visits is to be positive, be energetic, don't show how tired you are, that somebody just asked you the same question for the third time that you've been asked today, but just be fresh, enthusiastic, and do your best to persevere through the day, and know that once the day is done, you can kind of let your hair down and relax. But I think it's important to convey that you're not exhausted with the process while you're going through it.
Thank you. Yes, Jorge.
And related to that, at the same time, it's okay to be human, right? We're looking, as I'm thinking, as Dean and my colleagues and I are looking for, if you had a long flight, if you get a little stressed, whether it's a Zoom that's not working properly, or you're in person and your PowerPoint presentation is not open up, or you open up the wrong version and you show your baby or something. It's okay to do that, because we're not, whether it's a Zoom type of interview, whether it's in person, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for passion, right? And part of passion is the excitement, but also the fear of when you're passionate about something, you carry all the emotions, right? And so it's true that when we are in the job market, as Catherine is saying, you want to put in your best foot and your best effort, but it's okay to trip, right? It's okay to you're eating a dinner, whether online, and you make a mistake and you spill food on yourself. What are you going to do? Laugh it off. You're human, right? So keep that in mind. We all been through those moments ourselves at different points in time.
Absolutely, it's very true, and there isn't a perfect interview experience, but we certainly can learn a lot about somebody on both sides, and how they handle stress, and how they react when they do spill their dinner down the front of them, or their computer isn't working. Because you'll also learn things about where you're interviewing and your future potential colleagues based on how they treat you and how they handle the stress in the moment. So the assessments work in both ways. You better believe we're always on our best behavior too.
Thank you, everyone. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. Question is this: any advice for scholars who study topics that are considered non-traditional in social work? Do you think schools are expanding their scope of study? Any takers from our panelists?
I'll share a thought, Brad. It may not be directly the most direct way to answer this question, though. I think as job seekers prepare for this particular market, that, as we were talking about before this began, it is in fact competitive. We want to really think about the university, the department's needs, what they're expecting from a candidate, and how does my work fit into that? How does your work fit into that? Is this going to not just meet the needs of the university, or is this university or organization going to meet your needs as it relates to your future research trajectory or your future quality of life or whatever it is that you're looking for. Is really important to really think about that, whether your work is non-traditional or not. Really seeing where you fit in the midst of the mission of social work, but then also the mission of that organization and how your work will advance the work of that department or that school. And also how your work will be advanced because of what that school or university is offering you as well. So I don't know if that directly addresses it, but I think it's helpful to know that hopefully it's encouraging that folks are not feeling constrained because they don't have a traditional way of looking at a particular phenomenon or a particular group. It's just important that you convey how it connects to where you want to be.
Thank you, Marquita. Appreciate the answer. I'll pause in case any of other panelists have thoughts. And if not, I can. Jorge, yes.
No, I go to the next question. I just have
All right.
things to say all the time.
Okay. Okay. We've had a few questions about kind of the timeline of the interview process. And now pre-COVID, job applications might have been coming out, or job ads would be coming out in August, September, October. Screening interviews conducted at CSWE. It seems like COVID has really disrupted the sort of traditional schedule of things. So can you give us some insights about sort of what the schedule of things might look like these days?
I can start if you'd like me to, Brad. Just briefly.
Absolutely.
I don't feel that COVID has disrupted our schedule as such, because I think the hiring process and the academic schedule kind of dictates that. If anything, though, where it has maybe speeded up the process a little is we don't have to wait for CSWE and SWR for the screening. We're scheduling those earlier. And so I think it is speeding the process up. Because we're doing screening interviews first and then deciding from those virtual campus visits. So to me, it's kind of the same timeline, except it's just gotten a little quicker because we aren't waiting for SWR. I hate to say that, but we're not waiting for SWR to do those screening interviews. So it's kind of starting a little bit.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Catherine. Any comments from our other panelists? Yes, Jorge.
Even prior to COVID, you're right, Catherine, we saw this change where there was a time 20 plus years ago when the Society of Social Work Research was the place where a lot of these interviews took place. Then the Council on Social Work Education adjusted its schedule and they scheduled their conference earlier. And things moved earlier. By the time, if you walked with the assumption that you're going to interview candidate at SWR, you did interview a few people who already had offers from November, December, because they had interviewed in October, late October, early November at the Council on Social Work Education. They had the visit by December, early January. And by the time we saw them at SWR, they're like, I have 2 or 3, can you hurry up? And we had just started the process because historically by March, April is when you did the visits between January, March, April, and then the offers to start June, July, or September. So everything moved to earlier because of the Council on Social Work Education. And then we found that there were schools who had started this, it wasn't Zoom, Skype interviews. Remember Skype at the time? Mm-hmm. Skype interviews. Prior to, so we had doctoral students approaching us, faculty saying, oh, I just apply, and a week or 2 weeks later, they had a screening interview through Skype in late August, early September, and it was throwing us completely off. And then some of those schools, and I'm talking way beyond prior to COVID, some of those schools were inviting candidates to campus visits before CSWE or coincide. It almost became irrelevant for some places, the conferences, because they did the screening in September. By the end of September, early October, our doctoral students were rushing through to prepare because they had a different timeline. And then, of course, came COVID that stopped everything and made a mess out of things. And now I think schools are operating more independently of conferences. We'll see as the country opens up, vaccination rates increase, and all of those things happen, how much the traditional conferences will play a role. But you're right, that the disruption is that you don't need to go to a conference to meet people now. I mean, if we're doing full interviews through Zoom, why not do a screening interview? You know, and so, yeah, big change. But some of that had started a decade, about 10 years ago, 7 or so years ago. And yeah.
I agree, because when CSWE moved to fall, it disrupted the natural rhythm of how we did things. But
I'll pause just for a second in case either of our other panelists have any thoughts.
I was just going to say, and perhaps Catherine or Jorge can add or agree or disagree to this point, but I wonder if that had more to do with the competition and the more qualified candidates and universities vying for or wanting to capture candidates earlier versus later. And then, you know, doing screening interviews, which is what it seems, right? Where folks are wanting to capture candidates earlier so that they can hopefully get candidates that are, I don't know if most qualified or an interest for certain schools, it seems, and I could be off, right? So I'm just throwing it out there in terms of some of the things that I've heard from other senior scholars.
I'll just jump in that I agree that we do start early. When I know for sure how many we're hiring for fall, I've been known to advertise as early as May and screen over the summer and try to get them. It's nice to have a contract signed before CSWE if you can, because if you wait till SSWR, as Jorge had said, a lot of people already have offers and they're already on their way somewhere else. So it is, the competition is such for good candidates for faculty positions that we try to jump on it early. Absolutely. At least we do.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Our next question is recommendations or advice for international students on the job market. Recommendations or advice for international students.
I think if I may
Absolutely, please.
to begin with. Thank you. Being someone from a foreign country myself, the one key recommendation I would make, were first of all, when we advertise, and I think this is the truth across the board, we're looking globally. I think the one part that would be important for someone from another country is to do everything we've talked about: the immersion, the connectivity, the engagement, the being doing the deep dive with societal problems, the understanding of the isms that impact at least this country or the cities where people live. I think that's critical, and that might be a little harder for some, not for all, but for some. And that's not that one is not looking for someone who might not totally understand and get the context of the country, because some of it depends on positions. We might be looking for a global scholar, and someone from another continent may have that, and they really get what's happening there, and that's what we need. They don't totally get it here. It's okay. They will eventually, but that would be something for the international student. That I am sorry, I just realized I was making I made an assumption that by international students I meant a student who's graduating from a university outside the United States, so they're fully international. So that's where I was going with my answer. I will switch now to the student who is from another country, who is getting their doctorate in the United States. So they've had time then to build depending on how long they've lived in the United States, to build the knowledge, the depth of the knowledge about the country. So but both, whether the person is graduating from a university in another continent and have applied for a job here, or whether they've come to study to pursue their PhD in the United States to get their degree, in both cases is getting as much knowledge, depth, connection of what's happening around them or in the country, and what is happening in the university and the city, where the community where they're going to belong. Because the more one can demonstrate that connectivity, that connection between the conceptual, the topic that one is studying, and the people that your work will impact, and the work you're doing to improve their lives, the more enthusiastic students, staff, and faculty who are assessing you when you're interviewing will be, because they'll see like, wow, this person has an intellectual topic that's rigorous, a methodological approach that's exciting, and they're connected. They get it. They see it with the communities they're going to be impacting. And so, but that applies, kind of applies for all, but a little bit more attention, I think, might be necessary for people such as myself who come from other countries where we have different ways of experiencing the world, and we want to make sure that what we're conveying fits and helps build what people are looking for.
Thank you, Jorge. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I'll pause just for a second in case any of our other panelists have thoughts for international applicants and international students. Okay, our next question is, it looks like someone does not have an MSW, and what tips could we offer when searching for positions in social work? And then there's a few other people who second this question, and sort of asking about how to highlight prior work experience, but prior work experience when the candidate does not possess an MSW. Thoughts from the panelists? Would anyone like to start?
I'll start, I guess, just because
Sure.
I'm trying to gather my thoughts about it, because there's so many different dimensions to that question. Obviously, most of the time we're looking for a person that, with an MSW preferred, and even practice experience on top of that is even a bonus. But we do see applications without the MSW, and we've hired people without the MSW and that don't even have a PhD in social work. So it really has to do with who's a good fit for us. Sometimes we need the MSW and the practice experience just because of the teaching requirements from CSWE as to, who could teach practice courses and such. But, a large enough faculty usually can accommodate some people without the MSW and practice experience. So then it's making your practice experience, if you have it, or your area of research, really attractive, and how it fits is what was previously said into the position you're applying for and into the school you're applying to, because we have people without MSWs and with PhDs and other disciplines that are hugely impactful on our faculty and contribute in multiple ways and enhance us as a faculty. So I think finding a school that is large enough to be able to accommodate a certain amount of faculty without that is a good place to apply, and no doubt would be welcome. And from my experience, others who may have something different to say about that.
Sure. Rachel, I know much of your experience was as an MSW, and in your in the bio that I shared at the beginning of the webinar, you mentioned an LCSW. I wonder if I could put you on the spot, and maybe you can share a bit about how you, or to what extent you highlighted your practice experience on the job market last year.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, so I personally, in terms of courses that I've taught before, they tend to be more practice oriented, some theory as well, but I do enjoy teaching practice courses. And so part of that for me, in just teaching those types of courses, it's important that I had that practice experience, and that way I could bring in my own. And so I think that's part of like what I highlighted on the job market, right? Was that I have had different roles as a social worker, from, like intensive in-home services to telephonic to emergency mental health evaluation, outpatient, right? And so part of that is understanding how as social workers, what we do in the field is very dependent on what our role is. And so being able to highlight that with the students that I teach, and then also highlighting that in terms of that experience, bringing that into the classroom and being able to create case, studies that are based on my own experience. And so I can maybe kind of enrich some of what we're doing in the classroom and helping bridge that the praxis between theory and practice, right? And so being able to talk a little bit about how what we talk about in theories and in classes, how does that actually translate into the direct clinical work we're doing with families? And so, yeah, I think that was definitely something that I highlighted. So so I think that similarly, if somebody doesn't have an MSW, maybe they have some other type of direct practice experience, whatever that means for them, or, experience, I think highlighting that in terms of how that can enrich their teaching, enrich connecting with students, maybe how it informs their research and how they think about their research. I imagine that could be really helpful on the job market.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I'll pause quickly and see if any of our other panelists have anything to weigh in on.
I can just add quickly, just one thing. We're seeing somebody like your application, Rachel, would have stood out because more applications don't have practice experience, let alone a clinical license, than that do. So I just will say that if you happen to have an MSW and a clinical license and practice experience, I'd really highlight that in my application package, because that is becoming less the norm from my experience as I review applications.
And I'll just add one last point. I think, again, going back to understanding the mission of the school, understanding the work of the school, understanding the areas that particular school, meaning the department or the university, highlights as important to them is probably more beneficial for you to really think about. Do I fit in this space, right? Is this a school that values and places a lot of value rather on clinical practice? Are there spaces where folks without MSWs will fit in this school or this department? And that could be as easy as talking and finding out that, rather, it could be as easy as talking to someone at that school or someone who's connected to that university or department to understand in advance kind of what you might, is this a proper fit for you? Sure.
We've heard this idea of fit come up a couple of times now. It seems optimizing the fit between candidate and the institution is important. So thank you, everyone. Our next question is this. Any specific challenges for those pursuing an open rank position versus someone fresh out of a PhD program? So wondering if this person is maybe already an assistant professor looking to change jobs, or maybe even associate looking to move to another institution as perhaps as an associate. Yes, Jorge.
I'm not totally sure I fully understand the question, and I think that's part of, you were trying to say this seems to be someone who might be, because it really depends. If you're an associate professor and are you considering that maybe you can have a parallel move or thinking of a full professor. If you're an assistant professor, you're thinking of applying to an associate. And then if you're a doctoral student, definitely assistant. So I don't know if I have a lot of words of wisdom. I imagine some of that might be discussed earlier, maybe. Strategically, I'm thinking the candidate could reach out to the chair of the committee and say, could I have a conversation? I'm interested in applying. I've been an assistant professor at this institution. I'm about to get promoted on tenure, but I don't know, for these or that reasons, I'd like to apply to your job, and that's an associate. Do you think, it's sort of informal, but not really. Do you think I could apply to an associate? I notice it's open rank. Do I state that? And then each school would have a search committee. If they have an open rank search, may have guidance that's specific to how they're thinking about it, to what the provost of their institution has said, or have the internal practice. And so it's almost like I would, without the specific context, my recommendation would be to do a little preliminary work and conversation with the chair of the search committee. It might be that it says open rank, but maybe the university has a policy that if you're really not very, very close to an associate professor, it's better not to apply. It's more complex. Get in as an assistant professor, wait a year or two, then quickly, never quickly, be considered promotion to the next rank. If you're associate to full, institutions that are hiring for full are really looking for a lot oftentimes. So if you're in between the associate and full, having that check in, if people want to help, they want you to apply to the right position so that you can be your best and you can be evaluated at your best, rather than being a level of uncertainty. Oh, this person applied to full. They will never make full, but we'd love them as associate. Discuss that ahead of time. I think that would be with my thoughts at the moment, without the specific details.
Thank you, Jorge. Appreciate it. I'll pause in case our other panelists have anything to weigh in on.
I'll just add quickly. I apologize. We advertise often for open rank, and we're not looking for people to necessarily apply in their letter stating which rank they want, but they're applying to be considered for the open rank. And then there are people, as Jorge said, that are on the cusp, or clearly you can tell by, they're currently associate. Would they still be associate when they came in? Would they be able to make tenure here on that record? There's all those things you think about, but it's not really a decision the recruitment committee here would make. It's something you just apply, you'd come in and interview, you'd be evaluated. That's a conversation here that would happen with the dean if you're offered the position. What rank, with tenure, without tenure, faculty input. It's a complicated process. But I wouldn't let open rank discourage people from applying, because open rank, at least here, means we're willing to appoint an assistant, associate, or full. Let's see what you have, so it's kind of how we look at it.
Thank you, Catherine. Our next question is about references and letters of reference. When choosing references, should we include external committee members or committee members outside of our own institution? And what should we consider when choosing references? And I wonder if I might put either Marquita or Rachel on the spot as probably folks who have more proximal experience to the job market and selecting letters of recommendation.
Sure, Brad. I would say both. Oftentimes, positions ask for multiple letters. I believe what university or institutions are looking for are folks that can vouch for your growth, your connection to your research, your understanding of your research, your engagement in your research, and being able to speak on your behalf regarding your progress, regarding their faith in your progress. Usually comes from someone who's worked closely with you, like a committee member, and also an external member of your committee or an external mentor, which I think are all both options Yeah, so I would actually say both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me, I was really lucky to have I think there are just some really amazing faculty at the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work. So I'll just throw that out there since that's where I finished my PhD. But yeah, I was really lucky to have really great relationships with people in my department as well as outside of my department. And so I think definitely, like Marquita said, just people that you know, who know you well, who are absolutely going to talk about those different things that make you you and are going to be really useful into this position. So whether it's people could speak about your post MSW or whatever degree it was experience, or people who could speak about your research and your thoughtfulness or whatever it is, but can really highlight what the institution's looking for, what it speaks to you, what are the unique things that you bring into the position. And yeah, exactly.
Sure. Thank you, Rachel and Marquita. I'll pause it for a second in case any other panelists would like to jump in. Okay, the next question is asking about milestones in the tenure track. What are the major milestones in the tenure track, and what does excellence look like among prospective candidates? Do I have any takers? Or should I call on someone?
I can share or I can start, right? And again, I'm early on. I'm obviously not senior in any capacity, but I will share my awareness around what milestones are essential to tenure track. And then excellence, I honestly believe, varies across institutions and what that really means per department, per school, which then goes back to our earlier discussion around doing your homework and knowing exactly what is needed or what is asked of you or what will be asked of you. But in terms of the milestones for tenure track, I have learned or am learning at this point after having conversations with many of my peers from different universities that it varies. Obviously, every institution has standards for scholarship, service, and teaching. And knowing that upfront will be fantastic for you to know exactly what your capabilities are and whether or not you fit that expectation. And so those are the three primary areas, but there's variation within those areas by organization or university. So it's important that you really begin to think about, how do you ask this question? How do you crouch this discussion? And who do you ask? And at what proper time do you ask this question around what is going to be expected of me in these three areas? Because it will be essential for you as you are in pursuit of tenure.
Sure. Broach that topic carefully and deliberately, but be sure you have some clarity on it. Yeah, thank you.
Intentionally.
Thank you. Are there other?
I will just add, if I could, that, and I like what you said, is that also then in the interview process, ask what are the mentoring, what mentoring is available? Is there a formal mentoring program? How is it that the institution you're applying to in the school is going to help you achieve excellence? As a new PhD coming out of school, what are the resources? What's the investment in you at that level? When it comes to like at the associate or full, when we're hiring at that level, excellence is measured in different ways, but generally through impact of scholarship, at least here, based on excellence in scholarship and teaching and service, of course, too. But as Mark had mentioned, it's very fluid. It depends on where you're at, the type of institution you're at, how that's measured. But I always think it's good when the applicant puts it back on the institution to ask how they'll help them achieve that or how they'll help them maintain that. So.
Sure. Thank you. So yeah, checking to see what how the institution reciprocates.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me move on. Oh, Jorge, yes, please.
But that's a very good point. I think, when you're a candidate, you may not want to be as specific. You can, and again, we're humans, okay, but you might be worried that if you say how many publications, you can ask teaching load, and then the assumption is, you don't say how good of a teacher, you say teaching load, and you assume you're going to be excellent. Publications and grants, it's a little more contextual. Some places require a lot. Some places prefer that you write a book that will define things tremendously. Some places emphasize certain types of research, external funding, some a little less so, some value more community engaged research, some a little less, and there's all a mix, and it might depend on whether you're in the clinical department or track, or a macro policy, community organizing track. It all is contextual, but I like Catherine, what you said, the way you get into it, rather than saying, getting into metrics. Do I have to bring $100,000? Do I have to bring this? Do I have to do this? Is to say, as you're pursuing excellence in teaching and research, what's available for mentoring? And then let them, as they're answering, they'll be telling you, oh, because we expect these, or generally the people who have been promoted lately do these things. This is how we want to help you. This is how we're going to work with. And it's a way of getting the information without you specifically asking for really specific metrics that may be applicable or may not, and may make you feel uncomfortable asking, as if you're not going to work really hard for it, or it might be misinterpreted. So that's, I responded very excited about that approach. I hadn't thought of it, and it's a way to answer your question by having them tell you. Because if they describe things like, well, in our case, what we do is, in order for people to write a book or to publish one article a year, then you hear, oh, okay, it's one article per year. Somewhere else would say, yeah, so-and-so recently is in her 5th, 6th years, has got over 30 publications. You're like, okay, they're thinking 30 publication in 6 years. And so-and-so is a co-I on a big center. They're thinking center. So this seems to be important, versus of what they're saying. And then you use that information to inform you in terms of how this institution is thinking about criteria, which varies from institutions to institutions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
I will also just mention, in some of my campus visits, I actually had opportunities to meet with the P&T committee and have them kind of walk me through, what does that look like to tenure if I were to be at this institution. And so I think some make it a little more clear, and maybe some it just, again, it's so, like you said, it varies. Like Marquita said, it really, really does. And so sometimes you'll get to fill that out as you do these campus visits and meet with faculty.
Thank you, Rachel. Our next question, this is also related to publications and dissemination of scholarship and things like that. This person says, thanks for the attention to how the pandemic has upended and affected so much of everyone's lives. Can you discuss if and how universities are considering the reality of life for students who are preparing for the job market, and number of publications, conferences, and things like that? So I think to state the question a little differently, COVID interrupted a number of either data collection, or it delayed writing papers, submitting papers. It's delayed the review process for sure. So papers are under review for longer than they would have been. Are universities taking that into account as they're reviewing applicants?
No, go ahead, Jorge.
No, go ahead, Marquita, go ahead.
I'll just be brief. Just in my experience with our search process, I think that it was definitely considered, right? In terms of thinking about the realities of folks' lives, thinking about where folks are, thinking about the human element of obviously interviewing in this space and having come through a PhD program during a pandemic. So those are definitely thoughts that were a part of our discussion. And I would think, well, I don't know if I would think, but I'd like to think rather that is something that's been consistent across universities where some of my colleagues are outside of the current university.
Jorge.
No, I'll let others talk.
Okay. Okay.
I can add a little bit, only in that I think applications look like, because there's so many of them this year. I think people delay, doctoral students kind of prolonged their programs, it appears, and stayed another year before they went on the market. If anything, their CVs look a bit stronger because they had another year to get publications, presentations, get established in some ways. So I think I don't think that I've noticed things on CVs that I would say was attributed to COVID, except that you can tell when a person came out of their program a year later than they might have, but just because of the way COVID was impacting the job search.
I would just want to add one thing as a point of encouragement during this time where most of us are in a virtual space. I've encouraged students, doctoral students, to do as many virtual presentations as you possibly can to prepare for potentially interviewing virtually. Gives you obviously something to place on your CV, the experience of presenting, but it also gives you an opportunity to practice how you might be talking about your research in this virtual space. So I would just say take advantage of those opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. Jorge, I'll extend one more chance if you'd like to jump in. Don't be shy.
Well, thank you. I agree with my colleagues. We do pay attention, and it's relative to the large number of applications. So, if you have 40, 50 applicants, and you're looking for one person to fill one position or two, and 10 or 15 of those applicants are assistant professors at another institutions that are considering your school, their CVs are going to be way more advanced, COVID or no COVID. So what we're looking at all these applicants is whose topics is fitting, who seems to have the passion that would fit with us, because everybody's passionate about something, but which one would fit with us. And then we compare. So someone who's graduated from a doctoral program or doing a postdoc with fewer publications, smaller grants than someone who's been an assistant professor for 3-4 years somewhere else. In that case, it's as I'm thinking about the answer now, it's a little less about how COVID impacted, because COVID impacted everyone. It impacted some who are earlier in their career more than others. And what we're looking at essentially is, has this person taught before? Have they taught well? And what's their scholarship that fits? Now we have 30, 40 applicants, and we don't have the early assistant professor or mid-level assistant professor. And then it's more among doctoral students. One is still looking at the type of work they've done, how much they've published as students, what are some of the potentials. And then when we invite people, that's when we have a chance to interact and learn more, where they may have said, I could have done 5 times much if this hadn't happened. And then that's where you get a little bit more of the human factor through the interaction than when you're just looking at letters of intent and CVs and recommendations. But we definitely pay attention to that. But ultimately, we're looking at as relative to all the applicants and what does that look like. And yeah, sorry, that's it.
Sure. Thank you, panelists. I'll pause in case anyone has anything else to add. Okay, here's our next question. We've got just about 7 minutes left, and I'm going to try and get through this question and one more before we conclude for the day. Extensive literature shows the source of the problem for marginalized communities is systemic. That is, the way in which systems have been built and maintained reinforce this marginalization. The reinforcement is implemented through the construction of knowledge. Institutions of higher education are known to privilege Eurocentric ways of being and Eurocentric ways of knowing. Standpoint and strengths-based theories hold that to make meaningful change in marginalized communities, this change has to be done from the point of view of the target community. Are institutions of higher education ready to listen to perspectives from scholars from marginalized communities, or will they be expected to construct knowledge within the bounds of colonial tools, colonial structures, and colonial formats? This question concludes, we scholars from marginalized communities are also looking for excellence in leadership. I'll pause for a second while folks give that some thought, and then ready to hear from anyone who has some thoughts.
I'll start. I think as an individual that has multiple or maintains multiple minority statuses, I should say, that also comes from what might be considered a marginalized community. From my perspective, I believe in the realm of the academy, I think we are in a space of shifting in general, you know, both being a student in this environment as well as now being a faculty member. I think there are great strides that the academy as a whole, particularly social work, is making ground, right? We're really trying to make some shifts. In that though, you know, I think there's a term that says, you know, to move a large ship takes a lot of time, right? Like to turn a ship, I think that's it. I'm probably chopping it up, but the idea is that real change takes a lot of time, not just time, but a lot of time. And in that time, we are expected, unfortunately, to probably bear a lot of the growing pains, to be honest. And so the reality is that, yes, things are changing. But what I hope would be a takeaway is that you identifying what your passion areas and your research is should not be dictated by the expectation of the academy. If you want to be a part of this process, I would encourage folks to present what their work is, identify which university or institution would best fit that work and would be willing to support that work. And onward you go, because the idea is that change will happen. It's not going to happen overnight. And we have to be willing, we individuals that might be from a marginalized community, have to be willing to either be in it, to work and do the work and still be true to ourselves, which is a challenge. It is a challenge. But at the end of the day, you and your work are most important. And I would encourage you to stick with it because someone needs the product of your work coming from this space.
Thank you, Marquita.
Changing.
Thank you very much, Marquita. I'll pause in case any of our other panelists have something to add. Jorge.
Sorry, I feel bad having something to add every time. I'll try to be brief. That question is powerful, right? It speaks to everything, not just academia, right? The whole need for society to change. And I agree with Marquita, who's saying there's an opportunity now. We've been doing, we meaning social work field and a few others and several others, right, have been doing this type of work, paying attention to racism, oppressive systems for a long time. And for years, it was harder to get funding. Now they need us. Now everywhere they're calling for that type of work. It doesn't mean it's easier, but there is more attention to it, sadly, due to the unfortunate circumstances that we've experienced. And this reminds me, just anecdotally, I graduated from the University of Hawaii. I studied, my dissertation was on Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, and other Polynesian populations in terms of mental health, substance use disorders. And after living in Hawaii for a number of years, I went on the job market in continental USA. And so many places I got, this was not 35 years ago, probably. So many places would say things like, that's great what you learn about the Pacific Islands in general, not just Hawaiian Islands, more than that, Samoan Islands, other islands, a little bit about some countries in Asia. But in the US, in the continental US, our minorities are Black and Hispanic. So they was kind of scratch their head. How does your knowledge about Asian Pacific Islanders from not from the big cities in continental USA, but in the little Honolulu and Asia, how does that knowledge translate? And it would catch me so much by surprise that I would struggle answering. English is my second language. I was a doctoral student. I mean, it would trip me completely. It was the weirdest thing. It was sort of like, oh, I never thought of it that way. There's some core elements of my work that's universal, even though I did work with Samoans and Tongans and people from Vietnam and so on and so forth. But that was a long time ago, and I would get that. There was if you didn't do your research about Hispanics and Blacks in certain contexts, what do you have to add to our, and I experienced that. And, eventually there was a school that valued what I had to offer. And next thing you know, my career just took off in many ways. But no, I get it. Until the more of us are in academia, the more of us are making changes, the more of us are opening doors for the next generation. And there is change in the air, and it's happening, but it's not easy and it's not fast, but it is occurring.
Sure, thank you very much. I am deeply saddened to announce that we are at 2:45, which is the time that our webinar is scheduled to end. If I can just make a few concluding remarks, we will be emailing a very short survey to all of the participants. It will come out tomorrow. If you have just a minute to fill it out, it helps us figure out what programming is useful to the social work community. I also need to plug again all of the resources that are available on the SWR website for doctoral students seeking jobs, as well as social work academics looking to grow their careers. Finally, I need to thank our esteemed panelists, Marquita Dorsey, Rachel Spear, Jorge Delve, and Catherine Dolmas. We're so very grateful for the time that you've spent with us this afternoon and for sharing your expertise. Thank you everyone for participating, and to the participants for posing questions. I hope this time has been useful. Have a great afternoon.